I've now had the Nikon Z7 full-frame mirrorless camera body for about 4 months after moving away from the D750 DSLR. So I think the timing is finally right to reveal my initial verdict on the Z system. Now this video is going to be primarily focused on the Z7, but many of the points that I raise will be equally applicable to the Z6 and potentially even the brand new Z5 because those cameras share a lot of similarities. The Z7 first came out in late 2018 and represented Nikon's first entry into the full-frame mirrorless market, and many would argue a very late entry at that. I think it's fair to say that the Z6 and Z7 came in for a lot of mixed coverage, and perhaps the releases weren't quite as successful as Nikon would have hoped for. Now, I'm primarily a landscape photographer, so that is how this review is generally going to be geared. Having said that, I have been trying to diversify my photography somewhat lately, so hopefully I'll be able to provide a very well-rounded and to-the-point summary of this camera body. Overall, I think the Z7 is a very strong and competent first generation offering from Nikon that offers a very strong proposition, particularly for landscape photography, where I personally feel it really excels. But it does have some deep flaws that hold it back from absolute greatness. So let's get to it. What do I like about it? The electronic viewfinder. Now, before moving to the Z7, I had very limited experience in using EVFs. So to be honest, this was one of the main mirrorless features that I was potentially most apprehensive about. However, to cut a long story short, I have been very impressed by the EVF display in the Z7. The 3.69 million dot EVF is crisp, clear and pleasing to the eye. However, the real strength of the EVF sits in other areas. The ability to display overlay, exposure and settings details and your menus and even image playback is awesome. Plus the ability to just judge your exposure visually in your actual viewfinder and also focus anywhere within the scene is absolutely game-changing. Autofocus. Featuring 493 autofocus points spread across 90% of the sensor, it's fair to say that the autofocus experience on the Z7 is outstanding. No longer being restricted to the middle of the viewfinder is also really liberating, and the general accuracy and speed of autofocus on the Z7 is nothing short of exceptional. Many of the old reviews you'll find for this camera, particularly back towards its release, rightly teared strips out of Nikon for the poor autofocus performance on this camera, particularly in AFC mode. But a series of firmware updates have absolutely transformed this. Whilst of limited benefit for landscape photography, the eye autofocus and the focus tracking features on this camera have been greatly improved, and they're an absolute joy to use now, and they've really turned the Z series cameras into video powerhouses. Nikon have really closed the gap up to the competitors here, I feel, which bodes really well for the future. Z mount lenses. While not strictly a feature of the camera itself, I potentially think this is the single most compelling reason for switching to the Z line. And it's a motivation that's only going to get stronger as Nikon release more and more lenses, the price of second-hand Z glass comes down, and they potentially open up this mount to third parties. Nikon have come in for a lot of criticism on their slow approach to releasing Z lenses, and to be fair, a lot of that criticism is probably warranted. But having said that, everything they have released so far looks absolutely top-notch. I mean, the two lenses that I have, the 14 to 30 f4 here and the 24 to 70 f4, are absolutely superb, and for my money they're far better than any F-glass versions of these focal ranges that I've used for my landscape photography. The wider Z mount and shorter flange distance is allowing Nikon to push the optical performance of their lenses like never before. Compact. The Z7 weighs 675 grams, which is significantly lighter than any of my previous full-frame DSLR camera bodies. On average, we're looking at about 200 grams lighter. However, for me, it's the actual compactness of the camera body which is more compelling than the weight argument. The Z7 feels like a very compact yet highly powerful camera system, and the same applies to the f4 lenses that I equipped to it as well. Overall, it just feels like the right size. Not too small, but not too big. Build quality and ergonomics. Nikon DSLR shooters will find the transition over to the mirrorless Z system very easy to make. I found the transition very seamless because a lot of the menus, buttons and the general layout of the camera felt very comfortingly familiar to me. They've inevitably scrapped some of the buttons to accommodate the smaller body size of the actual camera, but all the key features are there where you need them, and the customizable nature of a lot of the buttons on the camera body makes it very easy to sculpt the camera to your individual needs. They've also incorporated the little joystick on the rear of the camera, which gets a big thumbs up from me. The camera is also fully weather sealed and just generally feels beautifully crafted and a premium bit of kit. And I have to say, this is one of Nikon's greatest strengths. They know how to design a camera that just feels fantastic in the hand. The sensor. Now, I originally fell in love with the D850 sensor, and I'm pleased to report that things are pretty much exactly the same here. The 45.7 megapixel sensor in the Z7 is absolutely magnificent. The crispness and the detail that I managed to capture in my images is nothing short of incredible with this camera body. And the dynamic range as well is still up there with the very best from any camera brand out there. Also, the high ISO performance on this sensor is very, very good for such a high megapixel sensor too, which makes low light shooting, such as with astrophotography, a real pleasure. IBIS. The 5-axis in-body stabilization in the Z7 is of limited use for my landscape shooting, where I'm predominantly shooting from a tripod, but for any handheld shooting that I have done for stills and video, it's absolutely come into its own. For stills, it allows me to push my handheld shutter speeds that bit lower than I otherwise would be able to, and provides that really reassuring security blanket for image sharpness, which is always better to have than not. For video as well, it's really good at ironing out a lot of those micro sort of jitters that you get in video footage, which can make video production look very amateur and, dare I say, a little bit vomit-inducing. Battery life. I think it's fair to say that the battery life on the Z mirrorless cameras is not as good as the previous DSLRs which I'm accustomed to using. But having said that, I've been pleasantly surprised by how good the battery life is, particularly if power saving modes are turned on in the menus and good general power saving practices are utilised. Now, that's the good stuff done. Let's move on to the things I don't like. Some of these are going to be very significant issues which cannot be fixed. Others are very insignificant and should be easily fixable in firmware updates. So in the incredibly unlikely event that you are watching Nikon, please fix some of these issues. There are rumours of an incremental S update to the Z line with a Z6S and a Z7S coming later this year or early next year, where hopefully, if that is true, Nikon will be able to fix a lot of the issues I'm just about to run through, which kind of reads a bit like a wish list. Dual card slots. Let's start with the elephant in the room, shall we? Now, to be honest, for my landscape photography, this really doesn't bother me at all. Yes, given the choice, I would probably always use a camera that writes to 2 card slots, but honestly, it really doesn't bother me for my style of shooting. The XQD card that the camera writes to are highly robust and reliable, far more so than the old SD cards. I've seen many sources actually claim that the odds of an XQD card failing are not far off the actual odds of the actual camera body itself failing, which potentially puts into sharp focus that a bit of a storm in a teacup has been created here. With all that being said, I can totally sympathise with those that see this as massively off-putting. If you're the kind of photographer that shoots events, for example, like weddings, it's absolutely inexcusable to be losing images. So you want all the redundancy and backup options that you can get your hands on. It's a bit of a silly mistake to make by Nikon, I think. Sensor dust. Now, without the mirror placed in front of the image sensor, it makes that sensor very exposed to the elements whenever you change your lens. The inevitable consequence of this is that the sensor is more prone to picking up dust particles and therefore potentially needs to be cleaned more regularly. Yes, dust is a problem with the Z cameras, but it isn't that significant, particularly if you take care when you actually change your lenses and you just put in place good practices. I haven't actually needed to clean my sensor all that much. Fully articulating LCD screen. I think Nikon are in danger of falling behind the competition somewhat here, where Canon, Fuji, Sony have all recently moved to the fully articulating screen approach. Now, the tilting LCD that this has got is perfectly fine when shooting in landscape orientation. It works great, but the moment you switch it to a portrait orientation, it becomes very, very flawed when you're shooting at high or very low angles. Furthermore, the fully articulating LCD approach comes into its own for solo video work, which seems to be a very big growth area in the overall market. I would undoubtedly use the Z7 more regularly for my video needs, and potentially I'd be tempted to pick up a Z6 and ditch my video camera, which is the M50 here, entirely, if it had a fully articulating screen, because it allows me, when I'm a solo video shooter, to line up my composition, my focus and my settings so much more easy when I'm stood in the frame myself. Clean LCD display. This one is absolutely ridiculous, and from a landscape photography perspective drives me nuts. The most frustrating thing is this would be so easy for Nikon to fix with a firmware update. Believe it or not, this camera has no display option on the LCD here, which doesn't overlay settings and exposure details over the actual composition. So as a landscape shooter, I want to be able to display my composition with no distractions other than just seeing where my focus point selector is in the scene. And this just drives me crazy. Please, Nikon, fix this. It's such a simple thing. User preset dials. They're deeply flawed on this camera to the point that they're not really nice to use at all. Now, the Z7 allows me to, in theory, save different settings for my stills and my video to each of these preset channels. So in theory, I should actually have 6 different channels, 3 for stills, 3 for video. However, there seems to be weird selective settings crossover between stills and video on these dials. For example, if I'm in U3 and I set this as an aperture priority mode for stills, then believe it or not, for video, it's also restricted to aperture priority. There's no way to override that. The same applies to picture profile as well. It's massively annoying, and I've encountered a whole host of other gremlins and glitches in these preset dials as well. For example, drive mode selection on the channels doesn't seem to be remembered at all, which is a little bit annoying. Overall, they're a bit of a mess. Depth of field preview. This one is another really annoying one that could be so easily fixed in firmware. Now when I'm closing down my aperture, which I tend to do quite regularly because I'm a landscape photographer who likes to shoot with narrow apertures, believe it or not, in the viewfinder and on the LCD, it doesn't automatically preview that change of depth of field beyond f5.6. Instead, I have to click the depth of field preview button, which I have mapped to the FN2 button on the front of the camera here. I have to press and hold that to preview that in my LCD or viewfinder. This is really irritating because when you're actually holding the depth of field preview button, you can't zoom into your scene to check sharpness in your foreground and your background, which is really restricts the usefulness of being able to preview depth of field. To make matters worse, when you switch the camera into its video mode, it does preview that depth of field as you stop down your aperture. So the camera is perfectly capable of doing it, they've just restricted it in stills mode. 30 seconds max shutter speed. Now I know this has always been the approach that Nikon have taken in their cameras, but I think in this mirrorless age, it's starting to look a little bit dated and restrictive, I think. Now obviously bulb and time modes still have their uses, but why don't Nikon build in some additional feature where I can simply dial in how many seconds of exposure I want and just let the camera run with that, or at the very least build in some sort of timing facility. As you can see, my list of negative thoughts on this camera are absolutely dominated predominantly by little small things that could be easily fixed in firmware. And on one hand, this is really annoying because I've got no idea how a lot of these things were missed in the first place and how 2 years later a lot of these things have still not been fixed. I haven't given up hope yet. I think there's going to be more firmware updates that hopefully iron out a few more of these issues. The fact that so many of these issues that I've identified are so simple is also strangely encouraging for those of you who are eyeing up any of the Z system cameras, because what I'm trying to convey here is the important things that matter, the camera overwhelmingly gets those things right, and it's only really being held back by minor things by and large. As things stand, the first generation of Z cameras like the Z7 won't be for everyone, but for landscape photography I think there's a highly compelling and powerful solution on offer here, which is really attractive if you're a landscape photographer, and I don't regret moving to the Z7 at all, and I would wholeheartedly recommend it if your style of shooting is anything like mine.